You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. Hello, I'm Keri Wong. I'm a psychologist and an assistant professor here at the UCL Institute of Education. In this episode, I'm delighted to be talking with Professor Tristan McCowan, Professor of International Education at the Department of Education, Practice and Society here at the IOE. Tristan's work focuses primarily on issues of higher education and international development. His research covers areas of access to, quality of, and equity in higher education, and relates to a broad range of contexts, particularly in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. He is currently conducting multi-country research projects focusing on higher education pedagogy, graduate destinations, and the public good in Africa. He is the principal investigator for the Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate Research Project, also known as Climate U, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council under the Global Challenges Research Fund. His latest book in higher education for and beyond the Sustainable Development Goals, published in Palgrave Macmillan 2019, and he is an editor of Compare, a journal of international and comparative education. Hello, Tristan. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Keri. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. I guess just so that the listeners get to know you a bit, how did you become interested in education?
Well, my mother was a teacher, so I suppose I had some kind of early influence in that regard. When I had finished my own degree, I got involved in teaching in different parts of the world. I taught in Italy for a while, in Tanzania for a year, and I was also a secondary teacher in the UK. And I think my interests were always around the international sphere. And I got involved in an NGO in Brazil working with street children and was involved in some of the educational programs there. And I became more and more interested in the role of education broadly in society, in development, in relation to the transformation of the lives of marginalized groups. And I think it's that interest that stayed with me throughout my career. I started to become interested in it more from a research and theoretical perspective as well, and particularly in the ideas of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator. And so started my own graduate studies, master's and PhD, looking into Freire's ideas and how they've been implemented in practice and the difference that can make in the lives of communities around the world.
Fantastic. So from what I gather, you work on, higher education and also the sustainable development goals. So I understand that there are many different sustainable development goals, but specifically you're focused on goal number 4. Can you tell listeners a little bit about what that goal is and why it is important now?
So SDG 4 is the education focus goal, and it covers a range of different elements, partly around access to education, ensuring no groups are marginalized excluded from education, partly around the quality and the content of that education. My interest in the SDGs and education is primarily around the university and higher education, which is an area which has been somewhat neglected in over recent decades. So after the Second World War, in low and middle income countries in the global south, many newly independent countries set up higher education systems and national universities and started to develop their systems at this level. But over the decades, and particularly encouraged by certain international organizations, the World Bank, investment and attention was withdrawn from higher education in many parts of the world, particularly through the structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 90s. And it was seen as something of a luxury. You could only really have a university system in the global south, in lower income countries, once you had set up a universal primary system and secondary system. Now, of course, no one's denying the importance of school level education. Of course, it's a priority. But what became clear is that you can't ignore higher education. If you want to have a strong and vibrant society, even if you want to have basic health and education, you need a university system. So my work has moved into the area of looking at the role of universities in development. And the interesting thing about the SDGs compared to the Millennium Development Goals, which came before them in 2000, is that higher education is back. So whereas it wasn't present in the MDGs, we see the entrance of higher education in the MDGs in three different ways. Firstly, as part of SDG 4 that you mentioned, Keri, higher education is one of the goals. So equal access to affordable and quality education at the tertiary level is a goal. It's also part of the education system as a whole. So trying to achieve sustainable development, citizenship, and so forth, intercultural understanding. But also we have a role for universities as drivers of the full set of the SDGs. So in fact, our project is not just about SDG 4. It's about the full set of SDGs, and particularly 13, which is around climate action. And this is the really complex aspect of the role of universities in the SDGs, is how the university as an institution, all forms of higher education, can promote all of the SDGs in addition to the education.
Thanks for summarizing that so nicely for our listeners. I guess, one question I have then is, what kind of universities can we imagine to achieve a more kind of sustainable way of life? Has some of your work told us or found out?
Well, I think we need to think about universities that are engaged strongly with communities of different forms. Now, there have been different names for this kind of approach or orientation in universities, sometimes called the civic university or the engaged university. In Africa, in the post-war period, it was called the developmental university. So this is a term that I've used in my work. And this is an approach where, moving out of the ivory tower, universities look for the practical impact of the knowledge that they're producing, the relevance of the courses that they're running, and work closely with communities outside of themselves, local communities, governments and civil society organizations, in order to maximize the positive impact in a service orientation, particularly with an egalitarian focus. So thinking about the most disadvantaged communities in society. And we've got some very interesting examples of what you might think of as developmental universities around the world. Just to give one example that I've worked with is the University for Development Studies in Ghana. So this is a university that's located in the arid north of the country, where previously there hadn't been access to university at all. It's an impoverished region of the country. So the establishment of the university there was a way of opening access, but it was also about a new model of higher education. So courses that were relevant to the local environment with a strong integration of the programs in local communities. In fact, at that university, all students spend a period of their summer, around 6 weeks, in a local community, running development projects together with community members and with an intercultural experience. Very often the students are from different groups from those local communities, so that there's that two-way process of learning. It's a learning experience for the students and also for the community. So that's what we might think of as a developmental university. In saying that, I'm not, of course, I think we need to remember that some of the traditional functions of universities are also important. It's not just about applied research and impact. I think we need to remember the blue skies or the curiosity-driven research of universities as well. That's very important. And for students and others interacting with universities, the space for exploration, imagination, and discovery. So it's not all about technology, applied research. It's also important to have this space for philosophy, for imagination, for creativity as well.
Yes, definitely. I definitely agree with you on that having this safe space to have these open discussions, to critique about ideas and have different and share different points of views, I think is so important and a key feature of higher education as well. I guess maybe just talking a little bit before the Climate U project, what were some other projects or experiences that have helped pave your way to this big project?
A couple of projects in Africa have been very helpful in paving the way for that, as well as some experiences I've had in Brazil. Brazil's a country I've worked a lot in and has been very inspiring. So in Africa, I've been involved in a project around critical thinking amongst undergraduate students across different countries in the region and the importance of innovative pedagogies. I was also involved in a project that was led by my colleague Elaine Unterhalter, who I think has done a podcast in this series about her work together with Stephanie Allais in Wits University in South Africa, that was looking at the public good role of higher education across those countries and how there can be unique contextual understandings of the public good in those countries. So that was a really important experience for me. And in Brazil, I've been involved in a range of projects, but one has been particularly influential, and that was a project with colleagues at the University of Sao Paulo and Campinas that was working in the Amazon region in indigenous schools, and that involved working with schools in that region, indigenous schools that were working with new models of education that were rooted in the indigenous culture, but also open to an understanding of other cultures, using research-based pedagogies, community engagement with students. And that was a very inspiring experience for me, where I could see and practice the kinds of alternatives that are being created on the ground in different parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. And, you mentioned the point or the role of culture and integrating and embedding culture into the research. What are some, I guess, take or lessons from those experiences that have really helped shape your current project, the Climate U project?
Well, I think, there are some, more obvious, more practical aspects of this, and then some really demanding ones, which I think remain as goals, but are as yet a long way off anywhere in the world. So I think, the most immediate aspect of what we're trying to do in the Climate U project is to bring together different countries and different higher education systems. So in the Climate U project, we have the UK, obviously, and then Brazil, Kenya, Mozambique, and Fiji. And a very important part of the project is the dialogue that we have across those countries, in a scientific sense through comparison in the different bits of the research, but also in a human sense in bringing the researchers together across those different countries, of different cultural spaces, to interact and to learn from each other. There's the language element. So the countries we're working with are all multilingual, but they have dominant languages in their higher education systems. So in Brazil and Mozambique, that's Portuguese. In Kenya and Fiji, that's English. And dialogue across those big language groups is very important. As I said, I've worked in Brazil for many years, and it's very disheartening how little interaction there is across the huge Portuguese language community and educational research community and all the published research there, and what's being published and read and discussed in English. So we work multilingually, and we try and bring dialogue across those language groups as well. But I think there's a broader and more ambitious aim, and that's to achieve what the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls the ecology of knowledges. So this is an ideal that we can move towards in universities and education generally, towards a pluralism, a plurality of ways of understanding the world, knowledge traditions within our higher education systems and even schools, so that we take seriously the ways that Indigenous communities, different cultures around the world, understand their reality and apprehend it and research it. There is some attention to Indigenous knowledge in environmental circles, in health research and so forth, but quite often it's of a fairly instrumental type. So using Indigenous knowledge around medicinal plants, ways to avoid the devastating effects of tsunamis and so forth. And that's important, but we need to go beyond these more instrumental aspects to really take seriously the worldviews of different groups, because they're enriching for all people. It's not just a question of justice for minority groups to have those views included. It's enriching for all people, including the majority.
Mm-hmm. And just to delve in a little deeper, do you mind just recapping a bit the study aims of the Climate U project so our listeners know and have that in the back of their minds?
Sure. So Climate U comes out of the critical situation that the world finds itself in. I'm sure I don't need to rehearse for listeners the significant challenges that the world's facing at the moment in terms of rise in temperatures, extreme weather, and loss of biodiversity and so forth. And the critical role that universities can and should be playing in addressing the climate crisis. Not alone, of course. All segments of society need to be involved in this urgent action. And in fact, that's one of the distinctive features of the climate crisis, that it needs all aspects working together. So it's some ways a technical issue. There are ways that technology can help, but technology can't do everything. It also involves behavior change. I know you're a psychologist, Keri. I'm sure you can talk to those elements, but there are some significant behavioral, psychological dimensions to this. There are political ones, there are economic aspects. The economic model that we have is not appropriate for a sustainable world and for addressing climate change. It affects all aspects of our societies, collectively and individually. And that means that the university has a role that goes beyond what you might immediately think that universities could do, which is conducting scientific research and innovating in technology. Both of those things are extremely important. But what our project tries to do is to set those in relation to the broader role that universities have in educating their students of all ages, at undergraduate level, graduate level, across all the different disciplinary areas, arts and humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences, but also thinking in conjunction with the other functions of the university to carry out research, to engage with communities in different ways, to contribute to public debate, and also, and this is important to remember, that universities are like little towns in their own right, sometimes large towns, in fact. Some huge universities are major communities. And so we have to also think internally about how universities work as communities and how sustainable they are, their fossil fuel usage, their other contributions, their carbon footprint, and how campuses can transform themselves. So that's the backdrop to the research. And what we're trying to do through it is to bring universities together to enhance their climate action, principally through promoting locally generated innovations. So across the 4 countries we're partnering with, 3 universities in each of those countries are setting up participatory action research groups involving researchers, students, community members, sometimes local government officials or NGOs, to come together and to design and implement and evaluate interventions in the local area in order to bring change. So that's the heart of the research. There are other dimensions to it as well. We're also conducting a large-scale survey of undergraduate students and their attitudes and experiences of climate change. We have a range of literature review and theoretical work as well. And as I mentioned before, the network building aspect of this is also very important as one of our aims, bringing those countries together, dialogue across those regions, and bringing in universities and researchers from other regions as well. So that's something of a summary of the project.
That's fantastic. It sounds like an enormous project. And your point about participatory research, I think, is so important, including various stakeholders, getting their points of views, and really working from the ground up as well and gleaning knowledge from that. So I guess, an obvious question that follows is then, is higher education doing all that they can to create this better world for the future generations? Do you think that there's definitely room for improvement, or we are pretty close to nearing that goal?
Well, there's always room for improvement. I think universities have really been enhancing their work over recent years. I think there's been a real crescendo of activity over the last decade, not just around climate action, but also more broadly across sustainability and sustainable development goals. So lots of new initiatives, individual institutions, networks across countries, regions, and globally. So, and supported by some of the international university organizations as well. So it's been very inspiring, the range of activity. And partly, it's important to say, motivated by students. So very often it's students in institutions who are at the forefront of these actions, pressuring those running their universities to bring change, divestment from fossil fuels, more sustainable ways of operating, and changing curricula as well, to integrate aspects of climate and sustainability into their curricula. So there is certainly a lot of sustainable, very inspiring work taking place, but it's important to recognize significant barriers as well. So firstly, but just by nature of types of institutions. So if we're thinking of the classic, research university with a whole range of activities across teaching, research, and community engagement in a campus, there's a lot of scope for this kind of activity. But we have to remember that across the world, the majority of students going into higher education now are not studying in these kinds of institutions. Very often they're studying in quite difficult conditions in teaching-only institutions that might have quite precarious campuses. Sometimes they are for-profit university chains that are very minimal in terms of the quality of provision provided. So the conditions of operation of many higher education institutions around the world are extremely difficult. And there are various trends that are making life harder still for universities, even with the best will in the world to engage in this important commitment. Marketization can make life difficult in terms of starving institutions of the public-oriented resources that they would need to engage. What Simon Marginson calls status competition, so that's the kinds of international competitiveness that's being fostered between universities, particularly through the international rankings. So we have the Shanghai, the Times Higher Education, the QS rankings of universities that are promoting, for the most part, excellence in research, but give very little value to community engagement and sustainability. There is an exception to that, which is the Times Higher Education Impact Ranking that's come out recently. But for the most part, the rankings do not promote the kinds of things that we need from universities in addressing climate. And there are other tendencies as well in higher education towards the dismantling of support networks for students and staff and precarious work that are significant barriers in this work. So I would say my overall assessment is there's a lot of appetite, a lot of very inspiring work amongst staff and students in universities, but generally the higher education climate is, to use the unfortunate use of the word climate there, is actually not propitious for this kind of work. The environment of policy and dynamics at the higher education level is actually acting against the kind of changes that we need in universities to really bring a change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with you in terms of all the challenges, and that there's definitely lots of excitement and energy in this space happening right now. And student voice is also plays a massive role in influencing policy as well. I guess then another maybe lesser known challenge, but we hear this all the time. As a psychologist, I guess there are also many climate change deniers, often people who believe in conspiracy theory that is also then tied to their inaction or decision for inaction. What are your thoughts about people denying that climate change is actually happening? And then also, oftentimes the scientists working in this space, they might get bad press or harassed because people don't believe in their facts. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, climate change it has an interesting history because university researchers have been very central to that. And as you say, in sometimes in extremely difficult circumstances of harassment and so forth from various lobbying groups on behalf of fossil fuel companies and so forth. So that's been very difficult. I mean, the issue of climate change denial is one that I've actually found quite fascinating. And I've over the last couple of years, I've tried to read as many of these books as I can, which has been a strange experience, actually. On the one hand, very distressing and irritating, but on the other hand, quite fascinating to try and understand the web of logic that supports and promotes these views, which are in a factual sense false. And I think we need to look at this in the backdrop of the changes that we've had in societies over recent years, what some people have called the post-truth era, the populist elections of Trump and Bolsonaro and the Brexit process. manipulation of social media, as you say, the conspiracy theories propagated through various networks. And I think it's a very difficult epistemic or knowledge-based backdrop at the moment, and one which those with an interest in distracting people from the challenges of climate change are using to their advantage. So people are sowing the seeds of doubt. And again, and this is moving into your psychological area, Keri, but given that it's so hard to bring changes to us, to our own lives and to our societies, when there are the seeds of doubt presented, it's very tempting for people to grasp them. There are also political questions of coalitions of views on right-leaning groups where anti-environmental views go together with other right-leaning views as a kind of a package, regardless of the evidence. So there are real challenges there. But my view is that we can use this as an opportunity in education. So it's a threat in the sense that it can lead to distortion of messages and exclusion of these ideas from the curriculum. But it is an opportunity for educators to talk through knowledge with students, to think about what the basis of the knowledge and the views that we are getting through the different sources of information that we have in the outside world, to talk through what are the motivations of different kinds of perspective and as an educational strategy. And it's crucial to remember that when we're thinking about climate change education, it has to be education and not conditioning or campaigning. It's about developing a critical sense. So it's not just instilling in students a set of fixed messages about climate change, however worthy we might think they are. It's about fostering this critical sense in students so that they can evaluate these sources of information in their own way.
That's fantastic. And I guess it also further highlights the importance of projects like yours and others who are, working in this space. And maybe just to end on a bit of a positive note, what are your thoughts, or maybe tips for those who are listening on the call now, perhaps students, those of us working locally in the community? What can each of us do to play our part, so to speak, in this whole important situation?
Well, I think it's important to remember that, despite all the difficult changes that we've seen in higher education in recent years, we still have a lot of space for action. So, those teaching in universities, we still have autonomy over the taught space and our research activities to a large extent. Students still have that space for action. And I think it's important that we act, and this is, I suppose, the old refrain of the environmental movement, is that we need to combine acting in these local spaces with broader national and global coalitions. And I think it's essential that we nurture as institutions those spaces for bottom-up action. There's been a lot of tension in recent years to alignment and coordination of universities' activities, and that is important. But I think we also need to provide space for bottom-up grassroots initiatives, of which there are so many very inspiring ones, to allow both that top-down and bottom-up interaction, which are both crucial. And we need to do that in mainstream universities, but also allow for the flowering of new kinds of educational initiative. So there are a number of alternative experiences, adult education, environmental collectives that are providing new fora for education and research in ways that we may not recognize as traditional higher education institutions, but are nevertheless paving the way for a new understanding of sustainability. And we need to remain open to these alternatives. The model of civilization that we have built over the last few hundred years has brought us great riches, but it has also led us to the brink of catastrophe. And we need to embrace some of these alternative worldviews generally, but also within education, in order to give us a chance of addressing the climate crisis and to create a world which will be just and enriching for all of its inhabitants.
Yes. And on that note, thank you so much, Tristan. It's been really, really interesting talking with you. And thanks so much for sharing all of your insights. I do think many listeners now will have lots to think about and perhaps reflections to make on how we individually can also contribute to this larger cause of helping our climate. So thank you for joining us on the podcast and sharing your work. We wish you well with your research, and we look forward to hearing more about it and the results from that project too. I think it'll be very interesting. Thank you, Tristan.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
You can follow Tristan on Twitter at McCowan Tristan to learn more about his research via the links in the episode notes. We've had some fascinating guests on the podcast, a real variation in topics and expertise across social science and education. Search IOE Podcast from wherever you get your podcasts, and to find our archive of Research for the Real World episodes, as well as more podcasts from the IOE. And if it's a musical interlude you're after, there's a Spotify playlist too, featuring songs chosen by our guests and the IOE podcast team. Just search Research for the Real World on Spotify. I'm Keri. Thanks for tuning in. Research for the Real World is brought to you by the IOE Marketing and Communications team,
in association with IOE Research Development.
This podcast is presented by me, Dr. Keri Wong,
and me, Dr. Sam Sims.
The theme music was created by Rob Cochran.
Tatiana Sotero Diaz is the series advisor.
Amy Leibowitz is the series producer.
And Jason Illigan is the executive producer of the IOE podcast.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.